Hey there, welcome to today's episode. We're talking about something every literature lover has probably wondered at some point. What's the real difference between prose and poetry? And while we're at it, what separates a poem from poetry itself? To help us figure that out, we are turning to the romantic poet and thinker Samuel Taylor Coleridge. In his book Biographia Literaria, Coleridge digs into these ideas and argues that poetry isn't just about form or rhyme, it's about imagination, emotion, and the way language moves us. A poem is just the result, but poetry is the force behind it. Same goes for prose and poetry. The line isn't always as clear as we might think. So, if you have ever been curious about what makes writing truly poetic or what Coleridge meant when he blurred the lines between these forms, stick around. Let's get into it. Samuel Taylor Coleridge is one of the most profound critics of poetry in English literary history. Although his critical writings are not systematically structured, his insights into poetry remain decisive and illuminating. In Biographia Literaria, Coleridge makes significant distinctions between prose and poetry, as well as between a poem and poetry. His analysis aims to define the unique nature of poetry by setting it apart from other forms of written expression. Number 1. Difference between prose and poetry. Coleridge begins by asserting that both prose and poetry share a common medium, words. Since both forms employ the same linguistic tools, the difference between them does not lie in the medium itself, but in how words are arranged and to what purpose they are employed. He states, a poem contains the same elements as a prose composition. However, he distinguishes poetry from prose by emphasizing their distinct objectives. The essential difference is that poetry is opposed to science, not prose. The purpose of science is to communicate truth, whereas the primary aim of poetry is to provide immediate pleasure. Prose is opposed to meter. While prose does not require a metrical structure, poetry often employs meter to enhance its aesthetic and emotional appeal. Coleridge also notes that simply converting prose into verse does not necessarily transform it into poetry. The essence of poetry lies in its deeper emotional and imaginative impact rather than its structure alone. Number 2. Difference between a poem and poetry. To the average reader, a poem is simply a piece of poetry. However, Coleridge draws a crucial distinction between the two. A poem. A poem is a structured literary composition that follows a metrical arrangement. It is characterized by unity, where all parts work together to create a cumulative effect. A legitimate poem is not just a sequence of beautiful lines, but an organic whole in which rhyme and meter contribute to the overall artistic unity. Each part of a well constructed poem enhances the meaning and effect of the whole, rather than existing as a collection of disconnected verses. Poetry. Poetry, according to Coleridge, is a much broader concept than a poem. Poetry is not necessarily confined to meter or rhyme. It is an expression of deep imagination, emotion, and thought. Coleridge asserts that poetry can exist in prose as well. He points to the writings of Plato and Bishop Taylor as examples of prose that contain poetry of the highest kind. The primary function of poetry is not just to create pleasure, but to engage and elevate the soul. In Coleridge's view, while a poem is a specific form of poetic composition, poetry itself transcends formal boundaries and can be found even in philosophical and intellectual prose. Coleridge's differentiation between prose and poetry and between a poem and poetry provides a deep philosophical insight into the nature of poetic expression. Unlike the conventional view that equates poetry with verse, Coleridge argues that poetry is a broader phenomenon that can exist outside metrical composition. His definition challenges traditional conceptions and invites readers to appreciate poetry not just as a structured art form, but as an intellectual and emotional force that stimulates the human soul. Coleridge's differentiation between prose and poetry and between a poem and poetry provides a deep philosophical insight into the nature of poetic expression. Unlike the conventional view that equates poetry with verse, Coleridge argues that poetry is a broader phenomenon that can exist outside metrical composition. His definition challenges traditional conceptions and invites readers to appreciate poetry not just as a structured art form, but as an intellectual and emotional force that stimulates the human soul. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share it with your friends. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next time.